He told, in a mansion very close to here, he told Katharine Graham's mansion, he told one of his best friends, Ben Bradley, who was then the publisher of the Washington, or the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, and Graham was the publisher. Bradley asked him what he wanted on his epitaph on his gravestone. This is when he was already president, and he said, "He kept the peace." He said the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. And he said that he didn't want children in Africa and Asia, when they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Alliance for Progress. He wanted them to think of USAID, which he created those two agencies in order to lift and run the oligarchs and all the foreign, U.S. foreign policy up to that point had been to funnel money to the oligarchs who said, and to the dictators who said, we hate communists, and to the militaries who supported them. And meanwhile, they were starving and oppressing their own poor. And my uncle said that is a formula for revolution, and you're creating communists by doing that. And he said America needs to be on the side of the poor. Actually, he had his two favorite trips as president. One was to Ireland, in which he famous when he left Shannon Airport. The entire Irish people showed up to see the first Irish Catholic president, a real source of pride to their nation. And he famously told them as he left the Shannon Airport that I'll be back in the springtime. And that's a promise that he could never keep. But his other favorite trip during his presidency was to Colombia, where he met the leader Yedis Camargo, who was one of the greatest Latin American leaders. And there's a square that's now called John F. Kennedy Square. There's a whole neighborhood in Bogota named after my uncle. And 2 million people showed up to see him in the square. And Yedis Camargo said to my uncle, and my uncle, Jackie later said after Jack was killed, he said that he was more impressed with Yedis Camargo than any leader, than any statesman. They had met de Gaulle, they had met Eamon de Valera, the George Washington of Ireland. They had met all these extraordinary leaders, Sukarno, etc., the liberator of Indonesia. But they said of all the leaders they met, Yedis Camargo was the most gifted. And Yedis Camargo said to my uncle, "Do you know why they love you?" And my uncle said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you put America on the side of the poor. They think that." And my uncle kept the country out of war. He didn't send a single combat troop abroad during his presidency. He realized 4 months into his presidency, during the Bay of Pigs invasion, that the CIA, the intelligence apparatus, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that they felt that their job was to provide a continuous pipeline of wars with a military-industrial complex. And I was at his inauguration as a 6-year-old kid, but I remember it like it was yesterday. And 3 days before, on my birthday, January 17, 1961, Eisenhower, the outgoing president, gave his farewell address in which he warned Americans against the rise of a military-industrial complex that would destroy American democracy, that would turn us into an imperium abroad and a surveillance state at home. And my uncle was determined not to let that happen. 4 months in, when he was lied to by the CIA about the Bay of Pigs, at the height, he took public, when the men were dying, 2,200 men on the beach, some of them dying, the rest being captured. He took public blame for it, but privately he said to his aides, "I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." And for the next 3 years, he was battling against that apparatus to keep the country out of war. They wanted to go in 61 into Cuba, 62 into Berlin, 62 into Cuba again. 61 into Laos, which he refused. They called him a traitor. He refused to send combat troops to Vietnam. They wanted 250,000. He sent 16,000 advisors, ultimately under great pressure, Green Berets. And by the way, he sent more than that. He sent about 20,000 troops to get one black man, James Meredith, into Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. It was a small number of troops. And in November of 1963, or October 23rd of 1963, he heard that a Green Beret had died. And he called Walt Rostow, who was one of his aides, and he said, I want a casualty list. And Rostow brought him that list, and it was 75 Americans had died. And he said, that's too many. I'm bringing them all home. And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all combat troops, all military personnel home from Vietnam by 65, with the first 1,000 coming home in December of 63, so a month later. 4 weeks to the day after he signed that order, he was murdered. And a week after that, President Johnson remanded that order and then sent 250,000 troops there. And, you know, my father ran against the war in 68, was killed. Nixon became president, sent 500,000 troops there. 56,000 never came home, including my cousin George Skakel, who was killed in the Tet Offensive. And but one of the ways that my uncle kept us out of war was because he said, always put yourself in the shoes of your opponent. And he was able, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, to put himself into the shoes of Khrushchev and understand. And he put in a hotline to Khrushchev for the first time. The CIA had no idea what was happening in the Kremlin because there was a mole at Langley, and all the spies, as soon as they turned, were killed. So they didn't know who, they saw it as a monolith. And my uncle said, it couldn't be that. It's got to be just like Boston, where everybody's fighting each other on the local level. That's how politics works. And he found out that was true. And then he started this extraordinary correspondence with Khrushchev, where they sent 26 letters to each other. And secretly, my father had a friend, my father and mother, called Georgy Bolshoi, who was a KGB spy. And he used to come to our house at Hickory Hill all the time. The State Department was horrified because everybody knew he was a spy. But we loved him as kids because he would do the Cossack dancing, and he had all these kind of tricks, and he would do rope climbing contests with my dad and push-up contests. And the first of the letters that Khrushchev knew, my father trusted him. And the first of the letters, he didn't want to go through his own apparatus, so he gave it to Bolshoi, and Bolshoi came and gave it to my dad. And then they smuggled 26 private letters back and forth to each other, these extraordinary personal letters talking about their lives, their children. And they installed a hotline. So there was a red phone at the White House and also in our house at the Cape. And we all knew not to touch it because if you lifted it up, Khrushchev was getting it. But it was that curiosity that he had that allowed him to understand it couldn't be a monolith. They couldn't all be evil people like these cartoon depictions that we always get about our enemies. It has to be more complicated than that. And they realized, Khrushchev and my uncle were both war heroes. They had both fought, and they both understood how bad war was. Khrushchev had been at Stalingrad, and which was the worst battle of World War II. And neither of them wanted to get us into another war. And, because of my uncle's forbearance, and because of his decision to project economic power abroad rather than military power, there are today more statues to John Kennedy, more boulevards named after him, more avenues, more streets, more neighborhoods, more universities in Latin America and Africa and Asia than any other president, U.S. president, and probably more than all the other presidents combined. And I run into people from Africa all the time. I ran into one last night whose name is Kennedy, because of the love and affection people had for our country all over the world. And that was a huge asset for us. You know, we've spent $8 trillion on wars over the past 20 years and bombing things, you know, and made ourselves less safe home and abroad, less popular, fewer friends. BRICS is a direct result of that. And we're bankrupt now. Our kids are $34 trillion in debt to pay for this. During that same period, the Chinese have spent $8 trillion while we've been bombing bridges, ports, hospitals, schools. The Chinese have been building them. And they've, you know, with their Belt and Road program, they're now the biggest creditor in Latin America and in almost every country in Africa. That's where we were 10 years ago. And we don't even have relationships with these countries anymore.